Hi there and welcome to Mastering V-Ray episode 5. This lesson is going to be an introduction to the newly released V-Ray 3 and some of the important new features which play a major role in the changed workflow I've adapted since upgrading. I should also note I'm fully set up now at home and very shortly I'll be working on Mastering V-Ray full time. The course is nearly 1,000 people now, and in order to keep up the quality, consistency and accuracy of everything, going full time's kind of been the only way to achieve that. Now I've just come off a couple of weeks break in order to make sure I wasn't burning myself out. I was doing some pretty long hours, and you have to remember I've got a full-time job also, which, like I was saying, I should be out of very shortly. But I'm fully ready to go now, and I've got a lot of motivation now that I've got that positive effect of knowing that I can be working on this every day. Now, to get started, I'm going to give you a quick rundown of the UI changes that make a lot more sense now that things are grouped together correctly, and you will see why things might have been a bit confusing for people before when I released that first video. So it's great to see some positive effects that the course has had not only on your individual knowledge, but on the actual software itself. So for those of you who have already upgraded to V-Ray 3, you've probably already gotten used to the UI changes. However, I need to quickly run through that for the people who are still on 2.4 and who are interested in going to 3. And the first thing you'll notice is when you open up and install V-Ray 3 is this brand new toolbar that's by default on the left. Now I prefer to drag that to the top. I've kept it on the left just for the sake of consistency with what you're going to see. But basically this toolbar gives you access to all the important V-Ray settings, materials and lighting, set like different types of lights, and it just gives you a shortcut menu. It's really great. The only problem is I've been using V-Ray now for so long that I've kind of gotten used to going into the toolbar on the right here and creating stuff via this menu. But I'm trying to force myself to change. But those of you who are new to V-Ray, definitely swap and start using this on the left because it's just much faster. So if I want to create a new V-Ray material, rather than going into here, clicking here and then making another V-Ray material, all I have to do is just go one click, bang, it puts it up on the first slot of the material editor. Same goes if you're in a different part of the UI here and you want to make a V-Ray light. Now it's just very simple just to click and drag, and speeds things up quite a lot. Another thing you'll notice in this toolbar is that there's a V-Ray Quick Settings dialog box. Now this is very similar to Arnold in the way it works, which is great. It's always awesome to know that you've got all those high-end features and things that give you more power with V-Ray, but at the same time Vlado and ChaosScript themselves are starting to realize that people new to V-Ray, they want something that's easy to use, easy to understand, and even if they're not getting the best render times possible, it means they don't have to get their head around and spend months learning the software. I personally disagree with that. I think if you're going to be a 3D artist and you're going to learn V-Ray, you need to learn it fully, and because of that, I won't be using this. Instead, I always prefer to know exactly what's going on, which leads me into the next part, which is if I open up the V-Ray render settings, you'll see that there's, for each little individual UI drop-down box, there's this expert button, and you can swap between basic, advanced and expert. If you want to change all of them, and I'll just demonstrate, you can see there's different little boxes for each section. You can change all of them at once simply by right-clicking those, and we're going to swap them all to expert. I don't like hiding anything. I don't like trying to make things simpler because my goal is to teach you exactly what's happening in V-Ray, not to try and make things easier just for the sake of it. The end goal is you know exactly what's going on, you know exactly what you're affecting when you tick things, you know exactly what to look for, because throughout my career, even though there's so many settings in V-Ray and it's what intimidates a lot of people, it's those settings which can really save you time and hassle on those rare jobs where you just might need to alter one little thing that gives you that effect, and renders like Arnold that hide things from you to make things easier on your brain end up losing out on performance because of that. Now, another important thing you'll notice as I'm in this settings box is that things have been shifted around, and ChaosScript have really done a nice job of laying out things correctly now so as not to confuse the user. If you go back and watch that first lesson again, you'll see that the global DMC settings, which are right here now, were in the settings box, which didn't make sense because, as I was saying, the two most important things in V-Ray are balancing the anti-aliasing versus the scene subdivisions. Now, the global DMC controls the scene subdivisions, and now it makes a lot more sense that everything's nested all together here in one go. So when you're changing and optimizing your scene, you don't have to go back and forth between the V-Ray tab and the settings tab. All your settings, which will adjust the materials and everything else in your scene, are fully accessible now in this little area. So aside from those major UI changes and shifting dialog boxes, the only thing you really need to worry about is the new buttons and features that have been implemented into this new UI, or altered UI. So we're going to get started on jumping straight into this new workflow I've developed that is based around this single button here, this divide shading subdivs button. If you remember in the first lesson, I was saying it's quite confusing for users when V-Ray automatically tries to optimize the AA and your scene subdivisions for you. And it becomes a little bit of a battle when you're adjusting your scene subdivisions and then you need to change or increase your AA, and all of a sudden your scene subdivisions get reduced. The whole point of this button being implemented is, and I probably push for it more than anyone, so I'm responsible for that being there. So now I've got to back up why it is in there, because if you look in the help index, you'll see that Vlado wasn't too happy about it being implemented, simply because he didn't think it would make things easier or simpler for the user. Instead, it's just another button that makes things more complicated for people to understand. I'm going to explain this for you, and I'm going to break down this new workflow, which in my mind makes a little bit more sense. However, there's pros and cons to it, but I think from a new user's point of view and from a professional's point of view who sometimes doesn't have heaps of time to go in and perfectly balance every setting, when you start a new scene, you just want to go in, set your scene subdivisions correctly, and know that you can increase the AA separate from those, so that if you want to reduce your render time, you simply drop the AA down, your scene subdivisions will stay the same, but your AA will be reduced and therefore the render time will increase. The same goes for the scene subdivisions. If you're happy with the amount of AA happening and all you want to do is reduce the scene subdivisions, now you can do that. And it's this divide shading subdivs button which removes the effect that V-Ray once had, changing the two. So I'll re-explain one last time. This divide shading subdivs button, unticking this, by default you'll notice it's on. And when that is on, what it's saying is like usual, when I go up on the AA subdivs here, it's changing the global scene subdivs. And it makes it so much easier for me to explain that when both of these dialog boxes are right next to each other. So if you untick this divide shading subdivs button, now I can go all the way up from 1 to 32 on the AA, and it's not affecting any of the material settings, any of the light settings, or any of the GI settings. And as you can tell, when you do that, it makes it very hard to adjust older scenes, because with this new version of V-Ray, they've made heavy optimizations to the GI, and therefore your GI settings are going to be completely different to what they were in 2.4. However, just because they've adjusted the GI settings heavily doesn't mean they've adjusted the light settings heavily. So you can't just globally reduce all your settings at once, because now, in order to balance things correctly, you need to have less settings in your brute force GI. Now, to get started here, I'm going to drop the image sampler settings back down to 1 and 4 so that we've got very little AA happening in the scene. And if I go through, you'll see that everything's still at the default of 8. And on the light, we've got 8 subdivs. So if you remember in the first lesson, I skipped out on explaining a couple of little things. And they're just little nitpicky things, but they're the type of things that you need to understand to truly master V-Ray. One of those things is understanding the difference between samples and subdivs. Now, if you'll notice here in the global scene subdivs settings box, or the global DMC, you'll see here this minimum samples box. That's not the same as minimum subdivs. The way V-Ray works is it's showing you the subdiv value so that you're not working with very large numbers. In reality, what the subdiv is saying is it's showing you the power of that button. So it's 4 times 4. So 4 subdivs actually equals 16 samples. So you need to wrap your head around that and understand the difference. So when we're in the global DMC here, the minimum number of samples for each pixel in the lighting and in the reflections and in the specular is 8. So every single pixel will get a minimum of 8. That doesn't mean that every single pixel will get a minimum of 8 subdivisions, which would be 64 samples. So you can see now that V-Ray by default has implemented this minimum samples button to make sure that every single pixel in the scene has a bare minimum number of samples being applied so as to make sure that you're not getting heaps of noise. The reason why it's set to 8 is because that's generally a good number just to make sure that there isn't lots of noise even if you've got the wrong settings in the scene. So if I set the minimum samples to 64, that would be the equivalent of 8 subdivisions. So with that being said, I'm just going to render this scene. It's using an HDR from a friend of mine who I'm going to be doing this Clarity HDR stuff with. He's amazing at shooting HDRs. They're the best quality I've seen. And he's happy to provide one of these for free. So you'll soon see on the website some HDRs going up for sale with this new interface I've been developing. So let me just render it. And I'll show you as it's going that the render's not going slow, but you can see there's a little bit of noise if we zoom in close. And like in the first lesson, if I go through, you can see in the sample rate, it's behaving in a similar way. We've got red around the edges where we need them and blue in the areas we don't. The reason why this map doesn't look so adaptive between the colors is because we've only got a minimum of 1 and 4. So there's less of a difference between the highest subdiv setting and the lowest subdiv setting. If I went up to 1 and 16, we'd see more variation throughout the map. But for now, the purpose of this workflow is we're starting out with the minimum number of settings that we need. So at the moment, in the reflections in the reflections render element, we can see that having 8 subdivisions on that material isn't producing a clean result. We can see that in specular, there's a little bit of a noise, but that's coming from the AA. You can tell because it's quite clean in every area except near the edges. So we know that the AA needs to increase also. If we go to the global illumination, the same thing applies. 8 subdivs isn't enough. So for each pixel, sorry, for each pixel in the scene, we're getting 64 samples when we set that to 8 subdivs. So one last thing, if we go to the lighting's actually quite clean. We might not need to change that. So having a really low value now of 8 on the lights is producing a clean result. So you can see immediately that all the settings are drastically different to what I was using in that first introduction lesson. Now, that's not a negative, that's a positive, because now we're dealing with smaller numbers and it's easier to get a hold on what you're actually doing in the scene. So if I just cancel this render, we're going to go through and I'm just going to increase the individual elements one by one to show you the effect that that has on the scene. Just going to go into the material and set this to 16, and I'm just going to do a re-render of this small region, just because when I'm working on a job, all I'm doing is working in little regions like this all day. It's very rarely that I'll render the whole thing, because I've gotten so used to wanting to see things quickly and as fast as possible. I hate sitting there waiting for a render that's taking forever, only to know that I'm not even going to use it in the end anyway. So I may as well work in this way and see the final effect on a small region and know that that's going to work in the end on the whole board. I don't need to render the whole board to see that. Now, while I'm talking about rendering in regions and things like that, another massive new feature that was implemented in V-Ray is a progressive render engine. So it's working similar to things like iRay and Octane and Arnold, where you can progressively clear up the noise as the render time goes on. Now in print, I don't need to use that because I'm rendering jobs that are 7,000 pixels high minimum on average. So you can't sit there waiting for the render to clean up. Even if the render is going to take an hour, I still need to see what one small area looks like, make sure that's clean, and then I only need to wait like 5 or 10 seconds to see that small area clear up and know that when I finally do decide if I'm going to render it progressively or with the old method with the render buckets, that the render is going to be clean. So I've increased the subdivs to 16 here, which will mean 128 samples, and I'm just going to do another region render. But before I do that, I'm going to change the bucket width to make it a little bit smaller. And you can see that's cleared up the reflection, but it's still not perfect. So I'm just going to cancel that, and I'm going to go up to 32. And it's quite clean. So in the global illumination, I also need to adjust some things. Now, another little technique is, rather than keep rendering this region, when I go to render GI, it's important to sample an area which is being affected quite differently. So this material might have a totally different look in the global illumination pass compared to the floor, for example. So that's where I need to go in and change that render region division and put it over an area which will show me a better overall expectation of what's happening in the GI pass. So I'm going to go into the GI now, and I'm going to make this 32 and see if that cleans things up. So the GI is looking much cleaner now. Now I might have gone too heavy on the GI now, so what I can do is I can back that off and go to 16. And you'll notice I'm working a little bit quicker this time because I'm trying to show you guys just how quick it is to optimize your scenes. You've had a couple of months now to get used to the way I've been working, and nothing really changes. It's just the numbers change now. So yeah, going down to 16, we've introduced more noise, which we don't want. We want a nice clean render. So what I'll do is I can just go back up to 32, or even I can go halfway in between and just go to 24 and see if that cleans up the noise. And it's actually pretty good, depending on how pedantic you are about your render quality. For me, that would be good enough. So just to make things perfectly clear, I'll just go back up to 32 and leave that as a starting point, and we can move on to the lighting pass, and we can see there's not really any noise. If I zoom in, there's a very small amount, but once again, I've rendered a region which doesn't really show off what's any potential noise in the lighting pass. So I need to move to an area where I can actually see that. So if I go over here, we can see with that initial render there was a little bit of noise in that pass. So I'm just going to render this region now. Before I do that, I'm just going to select the light so I can change the settings if I want. And obviously not changing anything, it's rendering the exact same. So now I'm going to go up to 16 on the light. And we get rid of that noise. There's still a little bit, but just take a note, I'm in the lighting pass alone here. If I go to the final beauty, we can't really see it. But what we can start to see is that the anti-aliasing is quite low at the moment. On the textures, we've got a lot of noise, which isn't coming from any scene samples in the scene. That's purely AA, and that's the purpose of this shader ball having little elements like these little like these colored circles and grid lines, and even more subtly, just a subtle checker pattern on the floor. All of that has been put into this shader ball for a reason. When I was first creating this scene, it went through so many iterations to get to this point, knowing that the shader ball had enough detail in it to look photoreal if the shaders were detailed enough, and also knowing that from a technical standpoint, I had all the information to correctly change things and adaptively fix things based on that information I've got at hand. So we can see now that the AA is a little bit reduced. So I'm just going to go through and have one last look at all the passes. But before I do that, for your guys' sake and for the sake of it not being confusing looking at different areas with different settings, I'm just going to render the whole thing. I'll pause the render and we can start from this new starting point with these settings set to 32, 16 and 32. So the render's done, and there was a couple of things that took a little bit too long for my liking, like in here, and we will tackle that. But ultimately the purpose is just to show you this new workflow, to show you how it works. So I'm going to go through all the passes again, and you can see in the sample rate pass now that it still looks correct. We've still got that nice balance between the blue and the red where we want it. But in that first video, you'll remember what I was saying about when these red lines are so thick, it's oversampling, because in reality, if we go back to the beauty, the edge here is only a couple of pixels wide. But if we go to the sample rate pass, look how chunky it is. It's about, I don't know, maybe 8 or 9 pixels wide, and all those excess red areas, like in here, you can see it's not even needed. Like around this edge here, we don't need that. So once again, this lesson is just to further solidification on the reasoning behind this workflow and the reasoning behind explaining just how V-Ray works. So if we go to the reflection pass, the noise is gone. We've got no noise. It looks really clean, but the AA looks really bad. This is totally different to what was happening in the first lesson, where at all times there was some decent level of AA happening. We didn't get this perfectly clean surface and then a really rough edge. So the best way to avoid that is to not make the mistake of starting with the wrong anti-aliasing settings, or at least not starting with something so low as 1 and 4. Now, I really had to do that just to demonstrate to you guys the difference in the way V-Ray is working now, where you can see that with a low value of 1 and 4, we can still get really high scene subdivision sampling happening with low values. But my recommendation is to start out with 1 and 8, or with a scene where you've got really large contrasty areas, like say an interior where you've got like black and white texture, like checkered, like a black and white checkered floor, something extreme like that, to go 1 and 16. But I've started out 1 and 4 here just to demonstrate this effect where we've got one part of the scene sampled really correctly and the other not so correctly. So now we need to go in and just make sure that we get this AA correct, and what that will do is we probably will have to do one last iteration on the lighting, GI and material subdivisions, but it won't be a big change. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to 1 and 8, because as we can tell here, if we go to the sample rate pass, these red areas are still producing not enough AA. So let's just go and we'll see an example of that. So around here, it's all red, but the edges get a little bit jaggy in places. So what I'm going to do to fix that is I'm just going to go to 1 and 8, and if we zoom in here, we can see there's quite a bit of noise in this shadowy area, more than is